I'm building something in my house for my kitchen. I want to make a countertop from this recycled wood from a different project, but as you can see, it's quite bent. Now I don't have a joiner or a planner, so I'm going to build myself a jig, or actually I already did build a jig for flattening the wood. So the jig is going to consist of two parts. One is going to be a tray with some fencing on the side. One on this side and one on this side. My piece of stock is going to be placed right in the middle. And then I'm going to build a tray that goes on top, so a slider or a sled that goes on top with a couple of rails here and here, so that this basically slides on this direction. And in the middle I'm going to cut a slot with, again, a couple of additional fences, so that my router goes there and it moves in this direction. So, because this is the magic of video making, this is what the base looks like. So you put basically the stock inside and fix it in place. And this is the sledge with the slider where you put the router in and it goes in. I made it out of MDF. I've never worked with MDF, but I thought it would be quite straight. So I'm going to show you how I built this and also how it performs with my pieces of wood. So enjoy! So I'm going to start by cutting the fences, and I'm using this new to me truck saw from Makita, which is just absolutely fantastic. I did a try test to make sure that my stock would fit on my tray and to get an impression on how everything would fit together. You can see the two fences on the long side, and the sled is going to slide over those two fences to make sure it keeps straight and on track. And I will also install two ends at the short side. That made a total of 4 fences that I had to cut. And this Makita is just freaking fantastic. One more dry test just to make sure that everything will fit nice and tight before I start the glue-up process. Since my long fences were a bit too long, I had to cut them with my handsaw. The mounting process for the fences was rather straightforward. I put a spacer on the back end, I pre-drilled some holes that I will use later on to drive some screws and fix the fence in place. And then on the top side I used some glue on the bottom of the fence, and since this is MDF, I was very generous with the glue. Once the fence was in place, I used a couple of clamps to secure it temporarily, and then I just drove the screws from the back end. The reason to drive the screws from the back end on the vertical direction is to make sure that the flat panel that is going to be the base of your stock is as flat as possible and it does not deform with the insertion of the screws. The mounting of the end fences of the tray was basically the same. A bit of glue, some clamping action, and then driving some screws through some pre-drill holes.
mounting the end fences like this was in hindsight a mistake, because as you can imagine, the sled is not going to be able to go past that fence, which means that the ends of the tray cannot be reached by the bit of the router. So that's something I'm gonna have to modify later on. And with this, the bottom tray is finished. The base of the sled is a simple rectangle of MDF that I cut using the track saw, and it just needs to be big enough to fit your router, whichever router you're using. I'm going to be using a wired router, but I could probably build an adapter for a trim router. Once the base was cut, I used one of the guys to draw where the channel is going to be, to make sure that the dimensions will fit snugly onto my rails. The channels are going to be around 6 mm deep, so I use a trim router with 12 mm bit to make sure that the channel will be the same dimension as the thickness of my MDF. You can see how the bead does not go all the way through, and then by using the guide of the trim router I made sure that the cut was very straight. First cut was a bit too tight, so I had to do a second pass after a quick test, just to make sure that the guide will fit snugly but loosely into the channel. And that's just a perfect fit. Once I had cut both channels, I did a fit with my tray to make sure that my sled would slide smoothly through the entire length. The next step was to mark the channel through which the bit is going to go through, and I wanted to make sure that I use the maximum amount of space available and that the channel will be centered and aligned with the sides of my tray. This way I can make sure that my cuts or the passes through the router are orthogonal to the direction of the stock. I decided to cut a 3 centimeters wide opening, which I think will fit the bits that I'm going to be using, but I can easily modify this to fit a wider bit. To cut the channels, I use the drill with a circular saw to cut 2 3 centimeters diameter circles on both ends. And then I use the router to cut the rest of the material, and to ensure that the cut was straight, I use one of the long straight pieces of MDF as a guide, temporarily fixed with a couple of clamps. Before fixing the second fence on the sledge, I did a try test to make sure that my router will slide smoothly through the length of the sledge. And to put it all together, I used the exact same technique: a thick bit of glue and then some screws that are driven from the back through pre-drill holes. The reason to use vertical fences here instead of just mounting them horizontally is so that they add strength to the sledge. And what I mean with this is that by placing the fences on a vertical position, the sledge will have a lot of resistance to torsion. And torsion is what is going to make a cut uneven. One more final test before I put the stops to the router to make sure that the bit will not chew into the channel. And then I'm almost ready to start flattening some wood. One final test to make sure that everything slides and everything fits nicely in place. In order to keep the stock in place, I use a couple of leftover plywood pieces that I fixed with screws. I will probably be using double-sided tape once I do all the boards I need to flatten, but for a quick test this was a good solution. I also made sure that I put small pieces of cardboard in those areas where the stock was not touching the base. And then the flattening process was rather straightforward. Switch on the router, do one pass, go back, move the sledge and start over. It made almost no mess because how tight everything is and using the vacuum cleaner, so that was pretty nice. There were some leftover marks from the tooling, but those were quickly removed with an 80 grit and a couple of minutes of sanding. So this is it. This is how the lumber started. Let me just show you up close. So it's fairly rough and fairly sort of bent. And this is after flattening one side. So it's butter smooth, really smooth with only a little bit of sanding. And I don't know if it's possible to see how flat it really is, because I made one mistake, which is, my jig was not long enough. So I think I might have to do some adjustments so I can actually mill this, but you can see how much material it actually removed from this side and a bit less on this side. So you can see that the thickest part was on the center, right there, and then the thinnest was on the sides. Yeah. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did like the video, just subscribe and yeah, enjoy.